We're going to hear right now from expert we've been working with, Dean Taylor. If you read anything from his bio, I'll just tell you, read this one line, which is how he's been working for 15 years on low carbon fuel standard policy. And so it is absolutely fitting that we've invited him here today to share with all of you a little bit more about this policy approach, what it means for Wisconsin, how it's faring in other states, a couple states that have it in place, a bunch more that are looking in depth at it, including a number of states in the Midwest. So I'm delighted to turn things over to Dean. He's going to walk you through what he's learned about this and how it might be a possible way forward for Wisconsin. So let me turn it over to Dean.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
We can hear you. We can see your screen.
Very good. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the various low carbon fuel standards that are around. There's a lot of nuances between them, so I'm using the word typical on how the regulators have implemented it so far. But in addition, there's a lot of conversations on how to do it better. I think there's a lot of potential for the Midwest to improve on what others, have done, for the unique needs of the region. This topic gets a little meaty, I would say. I'm going to try to keep from overwhelming by staying really high level and know that there's a lot that can be borrowed from other states so that a regulator doesn't have to reinvent everything. At the same time, there's a lot of potential for improvements. So one way to think about a clean fuel standard is that it's somewhat analogous to renewable energy or energy efficiency mandates in the electric sector. But instead, the regulated party is the oil companies. They, both gasoline and diesel, must reduce their carbon intensity, or what is colloquially called CI. But there are other parties that are also involved that are the credit generators, and they are voluntary, but they also have to do reporting, sell credits to the oil companies to turn it into cash, and then sometimes comply with regulations on how to spend the proceeds that they get from their sales. The cool thing about a CFS is that it's science-based, it's fuel neutral, it rewards GHG performance on a life cycle basis. And there are a result over 300 different types of low carbon fuels that can generate credits. Almost like 270 of those are probably biofuels, but there's also different fuel pathways for electricity, hydrogen, natural gas. And then some also go further and allow oil companies to do carbon capture and storage or refinery improvements. One thing to also remember before we get lost too much in the details is that a clean fuel standard can't fund everything. The focus is the fuel sector. There's other tools that agencies have for reducing GHG from vehicles or reducing miles traveled. And also, it's not going to be perfect the first time out. It's going to be amended and improved over time. And it should also not hurt other funding sources. Remember, when I'm speaking of other tools in the toolkit, there's also funds from taxpayers, utility ratepayers, or settlement funds. Obviously, the neat thing about the clean fuel standard is the money is coming from the oil companies. This is showing on this slide, on the far right is a carbon intensity of gasoline and diesel, which is up around 100 grams per megajoule. What you're seeing here on this slide as you go further to the right is that some of the fuels can be much lower. Like the big green circle here is electricity, grid electricity, which is typically, depends on the state, it's somewhere around 20 to 30 grams per megajoule, so 70, 80% reduction. The black area here is all the different kinds of biofuels, and you'll see some of them actually amazingly are negative, grams per megajoule. The size of this bubble here is basically showing in a West Coast state the amount of credits that are coming from each different fuel. So you see that there's a lot of different options. I'm not going to go through all of this, but just to give you a sense of what I mean when I say there's 300 different pathways. Overall, the value of a clean fuel standard depends on the price of the credits, and that is directly tied to supply and demand and the design of the clean fuel standard stringency. So typically, it starts out slow, like a 1% reduction goes up to a 10 or even 20% reduction in carbon intensity for the gasoline and diesel. But credit prices can swing. I mean, California, for example, started first, and at one point they were only like $10 or $20 per ton. Now, for several years, both California and Oregon have had prices up near, $200 per ton. Obviously, that's a lot more valuable, a lot more interesting when you see those kind of prices. The other thing to know is politics will dictate a lot of what you do with a clean fuel standard. So you could start with the legislature, or you could start with the agency. Both approaches have been done. A lot depends on what is the regulatory authority in Wisconsin or any other state. And then the details of how to design the program also are influenced a lot of times by the politics. So whether it's the compliance pathways, the stringency, the beneficiaries. I mean, ideally, one of the coolest things about this is that you can get a lot of very different entities, from all the different alt fuels entities to automakers, utilities, charging station makers, farmers. A lot of other parties can also be part of the politics of making this happen. I mean, kind of going unsaid is that some of the oil companies are not going to be very happy with this. So a lot depends on how big of an oil state are you. And so, for example, in Minnesota, there were lawsuits from the one refinery in the state that caused some hiccups. And California is also a big oil state, so there was a lot of opposition from the oil companies, at least in the early years. The other thing to note is that it's a very broad program. It isn't just light duty. It includes all your heavy duty, aviation, non-road. There's very few types of transportation that aren't included in the current versions of LCFS. It's also worth mentioning that there is another program nationally called, some people call it the ethanol mandate. It's the National Renewable Fuel Standard. And that CFS is much broader and more rigorous than that, because it includes more fuels such as electricity, and it rewards all the fuels for reducing their carbon intensity. So it really is very focused on encouraging the next generation biofuels, for example, is I think one of the original motivations for the CFS. As far as operational, it is currently operational in California, Oregon, British Columbia. Canada, I think in about a year and a half will be operational. Washington State, the governor just signed the legislation to start the regulatory process. And then in the Midwest, the Great Plains Institute will soon be releasing a framework on their vision for it for all the different Midwestern states. There's been a whole process going on for some time. In the references in the back, I've linked to one of their things they've already published about some of the potential for it for the Midwest. And Minnesota, of all the Midwestern states, is the furthest along, and it's in conference committee as we speak. And with the House passing it, the Senate hasn't passed a version of the clean fuel standard legislation, but a major conference chair Republican is the co-author in the Senate. So hopeful, cross our fingers, that Minnesota will also be soon having a regulatory process for the clean fuel standard. And then there also in the Northeast, there's a variation on this concept called cap and invest that's being done, that is being considered in the Northeastern states. This shows just the example of carbon intensity, versus what is green line is what actually happened. The black line is what is what is required. The other thing to know is that the different fuels are sometimes treated differently in the clean fuel standards. When you say fuel sector, it could be fuel production, it could be refining, it could be distribution, it could be the end use and retail. They're all part of the fuel sector. So regulators for biofuels typically reward the biorefineries. There's some talk about maybe modifying that to let the farmers also get some of the value. In non-residential electricity, the regulators have chosen to reward the site host or the charging station owner. On residential, the regulators don't want to give it to the EV driver, but they want some surrogate to basically use the money instead. In other words, they don't want thousands or potentially eventually millions of EV drivers to have to go out there and sell their credits to the oil companies and turn it into cash. They've come up with a simpler system where you have a surrogate, and there's many different ways to do that. So you go down a little deeper, the things to ask on this is these three questions apply to electricity or biofuels or any of them. How are the credits calculated? Who generates the credits? How is the credit revenue used? And who oversees, credit revenue spending, the regulator on how things are done. So one innovation I'm going to walk you through for the potential for Wisconsin, assume for a moment that you have a future, say it's 2035 or so, where you have 1 million light duty EVs in Wisconsin and 100,000 electric trucks, buses, and non-road, out of roughly the 4.5 million vehicles that are today in Wisconsin. And assume that you can get the kind of prices that are happening in California and Oregon and a similar carbon intensity for electricity. The results on those assumptions is that light duty vehicles in 2035 alone would generate $600 to $700 million just in that 1 year for charging in all the different locations. Most of that, probably 80–90% of that would be in homes. The non-light duty, like trucks and buses, would generate about another 500 to 600 million in 2035 alone. The cumulative number over the next 13 years or so could be billions of dollars. So the dilemma about LCFS that troubles a lot of us is that all this money that I'm just talking about is needed in the early years, not in 2035. So say Wisconsin did adopt a clean fuel standard. Let's say assume that it starts in 2023, and roughly you've increased double the number of EVs you have to roughly 40,000 EVs. That would equal in 2023 about 20 to 25 million. So that's obviously a huge difference between what you would get in 2035. So one interesting innovation that nobody has done yet, but probably should be done, is to basically, instead of estimating the credits every 3 months, which is currently how it's done in CFSs, instead estimate the credits for a 10-year life of the vehicle. And it may be possible to do this kind of thing with some of the other types of CFS credits. And this logic is how it's done for energy efficiency programs today that utilities have for air conditioners and things like that. So this is an example of a really good innovation that could be done. Another open issue is how to bring on a compromise between the vehicle OEMs, charging utilities, networks, and non-governmental organizations. When you're talking about this huge amount of money, suddenly everybody is interested in receiving the benefits, especially on the non-residential and residential EV charging. And so there is very many different ways to do that, and we can talk about that more maybe in the Q&A. But it basically means that you would have different approaches to the different types of EV credits. And there are, for example, not only residential and non-residential, there's these things called base and incremental credits, where the base credit is based on statewide grid average, and the incremental EV credits are based on a bonus of doing better than the statewide grid average. The oil sector also is an issue. The Midwest tried to do this about 10 years ago. I was somewhat involved then, and due to opposition, that it went nowhere. And but the oil sector is no longer monolithic. There are several now that are owning charging station companies, so some of them are much more interested, and they've been able to reform the basic idea to add these things like getting credit for refinery improvements or carbon capture and storage. The other is how to bring the farmers and the biorefineries on board. For many, many years, that basically 70 to 90% of the credits will probably end up going to ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel, biomethane projects. So Minnesota, for example, is starting to explore credits not just to the biorefineries, but also to the farmers. And it basically, this program will not end up being an expansion of biofuels, because there's a blend wall right now, but it basically will lead to a decrease in the carbon intensity of biofuels. And politically, I think it's very important and useful to have the farmers and the biorefineries on board. Also, there's a huge need to bring in a larger equity focus, to have the equity groups help involved in the very beginning, And when I say equity, I don't just mean low and moderate income, but also BIPOC communities, rural regions, and other underserved. The amount of money that can go to the residential credits are huge, and a very large portion of them, half, maybe more, could be set aside for equity projects. I'll end by kind of mainly talking about some quick ideas on how to simplify the program. There's talk about maybe not having two regulators, but one regulator, that is, remove the role for the utility commission to kind of speed things up, to not have third-party verification on EVs. That's costly to the EV sector. To have some things be done not by the state regulator, but be done regionally. And then also to manage expectations. Like I said earlier, the regulation doesn't have to be perfect in the early years and can be improved, with amendments as it goes on. And lastly, I think it's important not to have any EV credits go unclaimed. So there's a lot of non-road sectors and other things where there are existing EVs, opportunities to have them. And lastly, there's a whole bunch of resources. When you get the slide decks, you can get these links to what's going on in the other states that I mentioned. So I'll stop there and open it up for questions.
Great, thank you, Dean. I think only you could, put my camera on here, I think only you could actually take what is kind of a complicated issue or approach in some ways, not to dwell on that, but make it seem kind of straightforward and at least identify what the different optionalities are. So given your work that you've been doing across different states and particularly in the Midwest, what would be your advice to policymakers in Wisconsin considering moving or exploring at least this option? Can you kind of put it in the context of all the other different policy measures? We've talked about a fair number of them already. How does it complement maybe some other measures? Do you see it as in any way a replacement for maybe some other options? Just trying to kind of put it in that array of the policy menu that's out there.
So it's a large amount of money. I mean, to do transportation electrification on the scale that everybody is talking about, it will take huge amounts of money. And like I said earlier, there's not that many sources of money. So whether it's taxpayers, oil companies, settlement funds, or utility ratepayers, at this point, we have to kind of try all the different sources of funds. This one, I think, is politically very interesting because of the broad and unusual coalition you can bring together of parties to go after this. So, for example, California uses a large chunk of the money on the EV side to pay for a statewide EV rebate. Mm-hmm. It also, the amount of money that comes on the non-residential side today in like California and Oregon is huge. For heavy duty vehicles, it's equivalent to about 22 cents a kilowatt hour. And that goes, to the fleets or to the workplace or other locations. That ends up paying for a lot of charging stations. So for example, a heavy duty truck, which drives a lot and uses a lot of kilowatt hours, that truck over its lifetime can maybe earn $150,000 in credit value. Cars earn much less, maybe $5,000 or $7,000 over the life. So gives you a sense of that there's a lot of money. There's a lot of ways to fund equity programs. I want to stress, I think it's really important to have the various underrepresented groups part of this so that they are involved from the beginning.
Excellent. And, that has been something that's, I think caught the eye of many policymakers as, especially as state budgets are always stretched, but, VW settlement funding is, kind of winding down, or at least certainly has a limited lifespan. And when you talk about the different players that can come to the table to make this option maybe more palatable or more possible because of that inclusion of multiple fuel sources, what what have you heard from that side of the industry in terms of biofuels, in terms of their expectations and what it means for them to be part of such a program? I'm just kind of curious how to, you know, consider, what are the things that they're looking for, with the acknowledgement that, at least from our perspective, ultimately we want to get to, an EV world. So what are some of the considerations that you're hearing about?
So this, maybe I'll show, yeah, I think you're seeing this slide here, which is
Yeah,
showing
yeah.
that
That's what
huge
sparked
amount.
my question.
Yeah, the huge amount that is going to, the only bar that is electricity is the very top bar. Look on the right side. So you can see that like 80% of the credits are going to the biofuel sectors. And the logic that the other regulators in other states had is that you need to find kind of the pinch point in the fuel sector. And they felt that the need for biorefineries, especially for the next generation biofuels, were the key pinch point. And so, having all the, the biorefineries on board for this is huge, because many of them are in rural areas. So that brings in another dynamic as far as the legislature is concerned, or even the regulators are concerned. The innovation would be to also bring in the farmers. Could there be some sharing of that, of the proceeds? So maybe not all of it goes to the biorefineries, but some of it to the farmers. And that's a pretty complicated issue. It may not be something you can do initially, but there's work done. One cool thing about all this is it heavily relies on the GREET model, which comes out of the Midwest in Argonne National Lab. And so that part, the regulator doesn't have to really worry about, because most of the fuel pathways have in many ways already been done by the work that Argonne National Lab has done.
Yeah. So we had a question about the credits and the different approaches to crediting. I'm just going to read it here so that you get it. From Kathy Kuntz, she asked about the idea of applying life cycle credits versus annual credits. And just wondering, is there any state that's talking about that or exploring that? Is that kind of untrodden ground? Or
yeah, the discussions that have been happening in Minnesota, that certainly have received a lot of buy-in as a innovation that could be added. But it hasn't actually ever been implemented. I think it's just born of the frustration of we're at this tipping point now with so many vehicles coming and so much additional buy-in on the need to address climate change and air pollution, that we need more money. And so this idea of doing the lifetime credits, or if not 10 years, at least like 5 years or something. I'll give you an example, like with air conditioners, you don't go out every quarter in a utility program and check, is that air conditioner still running? You do it for the life of the air conditioner. I think that when this program was originally designed, people were thinking the gas station model. Mm-hmm. And so, a fuel pump runs constantly, so it's easier to do it that way. But I think there's room for some innovation here on the electricity side to get some of this money up front. So your ramp rate, instead of being like I showed it earlier, would be a much gentler slope probably. So you'd be getting a lot more carbon intensity reductions and credits in the early years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Bring it forward where we need it as the technology evolves and the price is lower and so forth.
It's tricky. You want to really avoid having a $20 per ton result. So that's the tricky part, is designing the program so that when you bring forward the credits, you don't cause an unintended consequence like that.
Maybe one quick question, because we're talking a lot about different revenue streams and funding. What are the different scenarios for who decides where and how that funding could be used? Is that, how have you experienced that? What advice do you have on that in terms of the guardrails, or kind of who controls that spending?
You have to be careful, because there can be unintended consequences. If suddenly you do a big statewide rebate with this, then maybe your existing statewide rebate would go away, or that maybe the utility commission will pull back and do less. So there has to be a good understanding between all the different state agencies on doing their role. Because, even though this is a lot of money, it still probably is not enough. It's not going to pay for everything you want done in the big picture. At
Okay,
least
so,
that's been the experience in
yeah.
the West Coast states so far.
Right. So get some good people in there advising and looking at things. I think we're going to stop here. What I will share with the group is that we are working with Dean closely and trying to tap every morsel of insight that he has, and would be interested in folks who are interested in this topic. There's some other forums that we're standing up for some other states, and just love to hear the feedback from everyone in this setting, so that we can just get some feedback and insight. So thank you, Dean. Really appreciate it.